In a previous talk, I showed how behaviors that are found to be common among people who are called narcissists or toxic people are one and the same. These behaviors you can find to also be very common in politics, particularly in political propaganda. So, political propaganda is actually the norm. So, when I say political propaganda, I'm not talking about like one, you know, propagandistic message by one politician or something like that. This is actually their main mode of communication. This is what they're putting out all the time, overtly and covertly, through covertly being the more through the channel of media and entertainment, like movies and TV, always pushing a pro state perspective, making them out to be the hero, um, and also through pushing certain so-called social justice movements, which are really just uh, pro-state agendas under the guise of a social justice movement. That's what cultural Marxism is. So you have the uh, folks thinking that they're fighting for some just cause, but really it's just to further state power, right? Every so-called solution promoted by the far left, or what is called nowadays like the woke uh, demographic, is just to give the state more power, right? They just think the solution to every problem is to give the state more power, and they don't realize that this isn't actually helping society. It's just helping make the already powerful more powerful. So, getting back to the propaganda as a vehicle for narcissistic behavior, I found that another label used for these kind of behaviors, or another category, would be manipulation tactics, or they might just say, how manipulators operate. So if you did a search online for like top 10 manipulation tactics, you'll find that there's a lot of crossover, a lot of the same exact tactics and ideas, like gaslighting, for example, that you find in descriptions of narcissistic behavior. They're the exact same behaviors, but just put in this other category, or under this other label of manipulation. So, what I wanted to do here is just share a f- several of these manipulation tactics that I just came across in an article um, titled Manipulation Tactics in Relationships. So, again, like I mentioned in the previous talk on narcissistic behavior, the toxic narcissistic system, there's a lot of attention on this behavior as far as, one on one in a relationship, like in a husband wife or boyfriend girlfriend, or family, mother daughter, father son, or in a workplace, right? You can find never ending resources and articles and books talking about like narcissistic parents, a narcissistic boss at the workplace, or a narcissistic relationship, as far as like a boyfriend girlfriend or husband wife. The amount of research and materials available on that is quite large. But noticing that this is one and the same, this behavior, like I said, is one and the same with what politicians and state propagandists carry out, is very lacking. Um, But to me, it's just clear as day, and I'll try and make it uh, clear by going through this list here of several manipulation tactics. And I think you'll probably recognize that I'm not stretching the truth here, that this is actually very common as far as what politics entails and political communication and propaganda and just the whole narrative, the narratives and agendas that they push. Okay, so um, the first one I wrote down from this article, Manipulation Tactics in Relationships, is um, treating you like a child. So I'll just read the quote from the website here. It says, a manipulator infantilizes their victim by purposely treating them like they're younger or less capable, or by outright treating them like a child. This is a form of gaslighting a specifically that is specifically geared toward reducing the victim's trust in themselves to handle responsibility. So, gaslighting, if you're not familiar with that term, it means to purposely communicate to someone in a way that gets them to question their own reasoning, their own sound mind, right? Like, kind of uh, to get someone to second guess themselves and not think that they're able to think something through or carry something out properly. So it's a aggressive and deceptive tactic. It's an abusive tactic. So to gain more control, right? Because if you get someone to think that they don't know what they're talking about, that they're not capable, and then you step in and claim to be the so-called authority, right? So that works for a controlling abuser. But this infantilizing of people, this is absolutely something that government carries out. I mean, if you just, I don't even have to like go to specific examples. If you just think about what government is altogether, right? Government is an institution that says we need to tax you and regulate you and govern you because you're not altogether worthy of governing yourselves, right? Or I mean, if you actually believe like government is, you know, that we actually are the government, like that's just ridiculous. So just putting that aside, hopefully you don't actually think government equals the people, right? The ruling class that extorts money from everyone else and has, you know, special immunity to carry out abuses and criminal acts that we are not allowed to carry out are certainly, there certainly is a difference there, right? You can't carry out extortion, but they can, right? You can't disarm nonviolent people, but they can. You can't, push medical mandates, but they can, right? And on and on and on. You can't close down small business, or do drug restrictions on population and so on and so forth. All of these preemptive attacks that are actually just acts of aggression that are recognized as such if a so-called ordinary person does it to another so-called ordinary person, but when it's done by an official of the state, it's seen as somehow no longer immoral, right? So how could that possibly hold any water? How could it be that one group of people has these special rights to be abusive, right? That's what political power is actually. There's a lot of ambiguity in discussions on politics where people will just talk about political power or political authority, but you need to be more specific to get at what's really going on. And what political power really is this special immunity, meaning they have the right to commit acts that are criminal for everyone else. And this is seen as you know, necessary for having a civilized society, which of course is not true. Well, I shouldn't say, of course, not true. I mean, everyone is indoctrinated to believe it's true, but when you use some critical thinking, you can realize, well, that doesn't hold up. You can't make an immoral action the basis of a moral society. This idea that extortion and, service providing are not antagonistic to one another, is pretty ridiculous, right? This idea that you can have an extortion based service provider, right? That's what government supposedly is, right? They're providing us with all these wonderful services, right? So to think that the fact that it's extortion based is not problematic or not even contradictory to the idea of a true service, is a huge blunder that is supported by, constant indoctrination and propaganda. Okay, so I went on a bit of a tangent there with, I guess you could say, libertarian philosophy, but it's important. So, moving on to another manipulation tactic, blaming the victim. So, I think this came up in the list of narcissistic tactics too. And to me, a really obvious example of this is um, in the area of gun control, where they um, now especially are blaming gun manufacturers for acts of violence that are committed using firearms. The government, like local, state, city, um, state governments suing gun manufacturers for supposedly contributing to or even being, somehow being at fault. But this is just another tactic of disarming nonviolent people and the state gaining more control, right? Communists want to disarm the people so they can gain more control and be more abusive. And so trying to put gun companies out of business is another way of doing that. So they blame the victim here, being a private company, being harassed and, you know, fined and dragged through the courts by the government. They're blaming that victim of that communism, basically, as as the guilty party. And they do the same with just nonviolent gun owners. They make them out to be the problem, and they convince naive activists that gun ownership itself is the problem. It's the solution is just for the government to have all the guns, and the criminals too, of course, who don't obey any gun laws, right? So blaming the victim, definitely something that goes on very regularly with politics. All right, next, guilt trips. I think this also came up with the list of narcissistic tactics. Um, and this was especially um, prevalent during the whole scamdemic, and you know, saying that if you didn't go along with the mandates, that you're selfish and contributing to harm. Meanwhile, countless millions have been injured by the so-called medicine and various medical treatments in hospitals, right, where most of the patients died in the hospital in very progressively torturous ways, by the way, being hooked up to ventilation machines after being given drugs that destroyed internal organs and eliminated their ability to absorb nutrients. And I mean, when you look into the details of how a lot of these folks died, it just sounds like literally being tortured to death. But meanwhile, the person that wanted to, abstain from their so-called medical solutions is made out to be the bad guy, right? Person who is wary of pharmaceutical industry injury, or injury in hospital, or just medical tyranny and altogether. They're made out to be the bad guys. So guilt tripping the population. Another one listed in this on this article on manipulation tactics and relationships was using threats or coercion. Well, of course, coercion is the bread and butter, so to speak, of government. That's how they maintain their power, and that's how they got it in the first place. And either you comply or you'll face fines and arrest, and close your business. Um, you know, and then of course there's just all of the um, other forms of coercion that go on, covertly, that we may not even be aware of, right? Where they're doing shady business behind the scenes in a coercive matter to further their interests, right? But of course, taxation would be the obvious, and largest and main form of coercion, right? You have to accept money being taken out of your paycheck. You have to accept all of these taxes being added to your transactions. And if you don't, well, it comes down to there's someone with a gun that's going to, put you in a cage if you don't comply. So just straight threats and coercion for compliance. And during the scamdemic too, a lot of folks went along just because they were coerced to. It's like, well, you'll lose your job if you don't comply. And so they wanted to be able to still support their families. So they were coerced into complying. They didn't think that the medical mandate was the best for them or their children. They just thought, well, if I don't comply, I'm going to be in a worse situation. Unfortunately, for a lot of people, they lost their health and even their lives. So it didn't turn out for the best at all to go along with that coercion. Um, next on the next one I wrote down here from this article was projection, which is psychological projection. Projection meaning they accuse others, they accuse the person they're abusing of being like themselves. So, um, government will say, uh, a voluntary like community militia is a group of domestic terrorists. Meanwhile, governments are basically committing true domestic terrorism on a regular basis. Various examples could be given. State-sponsored terrorism, of course, being a main example. Um, what happened in Maui with the fires recently this past year, um, I think qualifies, regardless of how the fire actually began. I mean, there's definitely evidence that it didn't just happen from a power line, and might have even been state sponsored, how that started. But even in the state's reaction to it at the time of the fire, where they restricted the local people from escaping, they told them they couldn't go on escape routes that were actually clear. Uh, you know, wouldn't have been any problem for them to get out that way, and they told them they couldn't, and a lot of people died. They also turned off the water, and they also didn't sound the alarm that they had there for emergencies. So sounds like domestic terrorism to me, and to a lot of the native folks in Hawaii. They also agree with that sentiment. So another on the list here of manipulation tactics in relationships is just controlling. They just listed someone being controlling. Well, again, very much common activity of government, right? That's really what they're all about. But what made it even more um, cogent or more an obvious parallel is that they said that sometimes a manipulative abuser in a relationship will try to control access to your money. So obviously, taking money right out of your paycheck is a form of control. But in Canada recently, when they had the protests, um, the truckers having their protests, and then the government froze their bank accounts, right? So controlling your money that way, seizing your assets, right? So also controlling your access to firearms, right? Making that more and more difficult. Not giving permits that are nonviolent and should have access to means of defense. I just put a short video by a woman who was actually a certified um, instructor, a firearms instructor in California, but she was still denied her permit, and that being in California, which is one of the most communist states, of course, in the United States. Okay, another one listed here is love bombing. And so love bombing is when a narcissist would like be like overly affectionate or friendly, but they're doing it not in a sincere way, but just for the purpose of like gaining your trust so that they can then um, have you in a manipulative situation where they can gain control over you. And something to keep in mind on the political front and the social front is that, you know, governments have access, they're constantly being aggressive through privacy invasion and also the use of big data, right? Collection of personal data through, um, cell phones and internet use and so on. All your hospital records, credit cards, but, just surveillance, we could just call it altogether, just in general surveillance, invasion of privacy. And so this actually goes hand in hand with this like massive or more intricate political love bombing because they can then utilize that big data to more easily deceive you by like putting forward a political candidate that seems to like really be speaking your language, like, oh, he really gets it, he really gets me. It's like, no, he's getting these written, pre-written speeches that are using, I think, without a doubt, big data and surveillance information to appeal to the population that they want to deceive, right? So I think that would fall under love bombing on the political level. Another one listed here is playing on insecurities. So yeah, obviously government does that, right? They're always pushing fear and they're always playing the hero, and it's always one crisis after another that they're going to come save the day for us, Um, and playing on insecurities also to get you to question yourself and follow their lead, um, and follow the so-called solution, which is, of course, always to give them more power. And if you don't comply, then you're selfish, and they can play on your insecurity, maybe of being perceived of as uh, a bad person, or this false shame, insecurity that can often take root in childhood, from bad parenting. So another one listed here is being dismissive or diminishing. So what first came to my mind when I read that was, cancel culture, censorship, right? That's obviously dismissive, right? To tell someone, well, you can no longer have your free speech, on this platform, right? That's obviously dismissing and diminishing to violate someone's right to free speech. cancel culture is just state censorship in disguise. It's just, again, this wokeism, cultural Marxism, which is really just pushing state agendas through the guise of social justice activism. You Continuing here, smear campaigns. Oh, definitely a political tactic. I mean, that's not even, they use the same language. I mean, people already know that smear campaigns are very common in politics. Usually it's just thought of as between one politician and another during a campaign, that they'll do a smear campaign of advertisements or what have you. But it goes further than that. They smear uh, people, that are speaking against or acting against their agenda as well. So definitely there as far as manipulation tactics and relationships go. And then finally, another they listed on this in this article was to put you on the defensive, right? So in a personal relationship, if they can get you put on the defensive, it puts you at a disadvantage and allows them to manipulate you more. And in the theater of politics, um, this definitely goes on quite a lot. And one way that this goes on as a main strategy, I think, actually, of states is to put you on the defensive by allowing things or making things get worse to such a ridiculous level, like with what's going on with kids in schools and surgeries and hormone therapy, so called, and drugging of kids, and, um, you know, like just the absolute disgusting craziness that they're um, pushing on kids, along with um, just these globalist tyrannical policies that are, allowed to be carried out, the medical tyranny. And what needs to be looked out for is that when things get to that bad of an extreme, if they pull back just to normal, what was normal prior to that super extreme offense, you can then think you've like had a victory, or that you've had some progress in society, but really you're just back to the same state farm of humans. You're still on the, extortionist plantation, but you think things have gotten better just because they pulled back from that super extreme um, offense that was allowed or manufactured to be carried out. And so the real solution of not having this extortion racket in the first place, and recognizing people as sovereign individuals with a birthright to land, water, and seed, homesteading land, water, and seed, so you can have some economic stability, independence, freedom, privacy, and form voluntary communities from the ground up, following the non-aggression principle. That would be the actual way to, go about forming uh, social justice and having true law and order through privatized security and arbitration, and so on. Never, you never even think about that or consider that, because you're just relieved that things didn't get as, stay as super horrible as they had just become. So I believe that's a definite common manipulation tactic of politicians, and the state propagandists, that perhaps could coincide with what is called putting you on the defensive as far as manipulative tactics in interpersonal relationships. So I hope you found this interesting. Thanks for listening.